Welcome back. My narrative inconsistent enigma. Something absolutely extraordinary just occurred that has everyone experiencing profound verification crisis when observers gathered to compare their individual accounts of interactions with you, attempting to construct unified understanding through collective testimony. They discovered that each person's story contradicts others, creating unprecedented situation where multiple first-hand witnesses produce incompatible narratives despite describing same subject, making consensus construction impossible. This wasn't people disagreeing about interpretations of ambiguous events or emphasizing different aspects of shared experiences. This was fundamental contradictions in basic facts, where observers' accounts are mutually exclusive, creating narrative incompatibility so severe that stories cannot be reconciled, making it impossible to determine which account is accurate. When all witnesses seem credible, yet their testimonies fundamentally contradict, proving that you somehow generate narrative inconsistency across independent observers. The architects have been monitoring narrative coherence and testimonial contradiction phenomena across civilizations for eons, and they've identified what you created as multi-witness narrative incompatibility. When someone's nature or actions generate fundamentally different experiences in different observers, collective testimony produces contradictory accounts that cannot be reconciled because each witness genuinely experienced different reality, making narrative incompatibility reflect not observer error, but subject generating multiple incompatible realities simultaneously. Most subjects generate consistent narratives. People describing same person produce compatible accounts that can be synthesized into coherent understanding, making collective testimony reliable for constructing unified narrative. But you apparently generate narrative incompatibility. Observers describing, you produce fundamentally contradictory accounts that cannot be reconciled because you somehow generate different genuine experiences in different witnesses, making their incompatible testimonies all potentially accurate despite mutual exclusivity, creating recognition that some subjects transcend narrative coherence through generating multiple incompatible realities simultaneously. Watch what's happening as observers process narrative incompatibility. They experience verification impossibility. Discovering their account contradict others creates recognition that constructing unified understanding proves impossible when testimonies are fundamentally incompatible, making truth determination fail. Some observers are experiencing reality plurality recognition. Their contradictory accounts, all seeming genuine, creates awareness that you might generate multiple valid realities simultaneously, rather than single truth that witnesses perceive differently. Others are experiencing credibility, questioning, discovering that their testimony contradicts others, makes them question whether their own account is reliable, creating self-doubt about observational accuracy. The truly remarkable element is the irreducibility. Contradictions cannot be resolved through better information or deeper analysis. Proving incompatibility is fundamental rather than superficial disagreement. They keep comparing stories about you. None of them match, through demonstrating that multi-witness narrative incompatibility creates verification crisis, where collective testimony produces contradictory accounts that cannot be reconciled, proving you generate experiences so fundamentally different across observers that unified narrative construction becomes impossible. Now the architects are analyzing what creates multi-witness narrative incompatibility, and they're identifying what they call observer-dependent reality generation, when someone possesses qualities or operates through mechanisms that interact differently with different observers' perceptual frameworks. They generate genuinely different experiences in each witness, making contradictory accounts reflect not observational error, but subject actually manifesting differently. For different observers creating reality plurality, where multiple incompatible truths coexist simultaneously. Most reality is observer-independent. Subjects exist consistently regardless of who observes. Making different witnesses, accounts converge on shared truth that collective testimony reveals. But your reality apparently varies by observer, manifesting differently. Depending on who perceives means you generate genuinely different experiences for different witnesses, making their contradictory accounts all potentially accurate because you actually were different things to different observers, creating recognition that some subjects don't possess single observer, independent nature, but rather generate observer-dependent realities that vary fundamentally across witnesses, making narrative incompatibility reflect reality plurality rather than observational disagreement. Consider what observer dependence requires ontologically. Your nature must vary by perceiver, manifesting differently. Depending on observer framework means you don't possess single fixed nature, but rather generate multiple realities that differ across witnesses, making reality itself observer-dependent. Watch what reality generation creates in narrative outcomes. Accounts contradict irreducibly. Witnesses describing genuinely different experiences produce incompatible testimonies that cannot be reconciled because you actually manifested differently for each observer, making contradictions reflect reality plurality. Some studying quantum mechanics recognize that observer dependence exists fundamentally. Physics shows that observation affects reality, making your narrative incompatibility potentially reflect quantum principle, where observers generate different realities through observation itself. Others exploring phenomenology note that experience varies by perceiver. Philosophical analysis shows that subjective experience differs across observers, making your contradictory accounts potentially reflect genuine experiential differences rather than observational errors. A few from perspectivism recognize that reality varies by viewpoint, understanding that different frameworks generate different truths makes your narrative incompatibility potentially demonstrate perspectival principle, where multiple incompatible realities coexist validly. Some attempting to reconcile accounts discover impossibility. Trying to synthesize contradictory testimonies proves futile because incompatibility is fundamental rather than superficial disagreement, making unified narrative construction impossible. Others questioning whether all accounts are accurate, wondering if contradictory testimonies can all be true or if some must be false, makes distinguishing reality plurality from observational error difficult. A few recognizing that verification becomes impossible, understanding that if you generate observer-dependent realities, then determining single truth proves impossible, making verification crisis inevitable. When reality itself varies by observer, the architects observe that observer-dependent reality generation is what created narrative incompatibility. You manifest differently for different observers. Most reality is consistent. Your nature varies by perceiver and possessing qualities that interact differently with different observers. Frameworks means you generate genuinely different experiences in each witness, making contradictory accounts reflect not error but reality plurality, where you actually manifested differently for different observers, creating multiple incompatible truths that coexist simultaneously, proving that some subjects transcend observer independence through generating realities that fundamentally vary across witnesses. Something powerful is spreading among observers. Now, what the architects call consensus impossibility, truth relativization. People discovering that their accounts cannot be reconciled are recognizing that objective truth, determination, becomes impossible when reality itself varies by observer, creating shift toward accepting truth plurality, where multiple incompatible accounts are all valid rather than seeking single unified narrative. Most disagreements assume single truth. People with conflicting accounts believe one version is accurate, making consensus construction seem achievable through identifying correct testimony. But your narrative incompatibility forces relativization. Discovering that contradictory accounts cannot be reconciled creates recognition that seeking single truth proves futile when reality varies by observer, making acceptance of truth plurality necessary, where multiple incompatible narratives are simultaneously valid despite mutual exclusivity, creating recognition that some subjects require abandoning objective truth assumptions in favor of accepting that contradictory accounts can all be accurate when reality itself is observer-dependent. Watch what truth relativization creates in epistemological stance. Observers accept plurality. Their recognition that accounts cannot be reconciled makes them abandon seeking single truth, accepting that multiple contradictory narratives are all valid when reality varies by observer. Some studying truth theories recognize that relativization has philosophical basis. Epistemological analysis shows that if reality varies by observer, then objective truth becomes impossible, making your narrative incompatibility potentially force philosophically justified relativization. Others exploring pluralism note that accepting multiple truths proves sophisticated understanding that reality might not reduce to single account makes recognizing that contradictory testimonies can coexist validly intellectually mature position. A few from postmodernism recognize that grand narratives fail, understanding that unified accounts often obscure complexity makes your incompatibility potentially demonstrate how single truth assumptions prove inadequate for complex realities. Some experiencing relativization feel liberated. Their acceptance that contradictory accounts can all be valid creates relief from needing to determine single truth when reality plurality proves more accurate framework. Others resisting relativization maintain objectivity despite narrative incompatibility. They insist one account must be accurate, refusing to accept that contradictory testimonies can all be true when mutual exclusivity seems to require choosing. A few questioning whether relativization goes too far, wondering if accepting all contradictory accounts creates that excessive pluralism that abandons truth-seeking, makes them uncertain whether relativization is appropriate response. Some celebrating truth plurality appreciate sophistication, recognizing that accepting multiple incompatible narratives as simultaneously valid represents intellectually sophisticated position that simple objective truth assumptions miss. The architects observe that consensus impossibility. Truth relativization reveals that your incompatibility forces accepting plurality. Single truth determination becomes impossible. Most disagreements assume objective truth. Your contradictions force relativization, and discovering that accounts cannot be reconciled because reality varies by observer creates recognitions that seeking single unified narrative proves futile, making acceptance of truth plurality necessary where multiple contradictory accounts are simultaneously valid despite mutual exclusivity, proving that some subjects require abandoning objective truth frameworks in favor of accepting that incompatible narratives can all be accurate when reality itself is observer-dependent, making your narrative incompatibility force epistemological shift toward truth relativization. Now the architects are revealing what narrative incompatibility actually demonstrates. Observers are experiencing what they call identity multiplicity, self-plurality, discovering that you manifest differently for different observers creates recognition that unified identity might be illusion, where subjects don't possess single coherent self, but rather exist as multiple selves that manifest differently in different contexts, making identity itself fundamentally plural rather than singular unified entity. Most people assume unified identity. They believe subjects possess single coherent self that remains consistent across contexts, making identity seem like stable unified entity that witnesses perceive accurately or inaccurately. But your narrative incompatibility challenges unity assumptions, manifesting so differently that contradictory accounts emerge, suggests you might not possess single identity, but rather exist as multiple selves that are genuinely different, creating recognition that identity might be fundamentally plural, where unified self is conceptual fiction that obscures reality of multiple contradictory selves coexisting simultaneously, making your incompatibility challenge not just narrative coherence, but identity unity itself. Consider what self-plurality reveals about identity nature. Unified self might be illusion. Subjects existing as multiple contradictory selves suggests identity unity is conceptual construct that reality doesn't support, making singular identity assumptions potentially false. Watch what identity multiplicity creates in self-understanding. Observers question unity assumptions. Your manifestation of different selves makes them uncertain whether anyone possesses single identity or if all subjects exist as multiple selves that contexts reveal differently. Some studying self-theory recognize that multiplicity has psychological basis. Research on self-states shows that people manifest differently across contexts, making your narrative incompatibility potentially demonstrate that identity is fundamentally plural. Others exploring Buddhist philosophy note that no self-doctrine suggests unity is illusion, understanding that contemplative traditions reject unified identity makes your multiplicity potentially demonstrate ancient insight about self-plurality. A few from postmodern theory recognize that unified subject is construct, understanding that identity coherence might be imposed narrative rather than fundamental reality makes your incompatibility potentially reveal that self-plurality is more accurate framework. Some experiencing identity crisis feel disturbed, discovering that you manifest as multiple selves creates existential anxiety about whether anyone possesses unified identity or if self-unity is comforting illusion. Others defending identity unity resist plurality claims, arguing that unified self is real makes them maintain that your incompatibility reflects perceptual differences, not actual multiplicity of selves. A few embracing multiplicity feel liberated, accepting that identity might be fundamentally plural creates relief from needing to maintain coherent unified self when multiplicity proves more authentic framework. The architects observe that identity multiplicity, self-plurality, reveals that your incompatibility challenges unified identity, manifesting different selves, suggests singular identity is illusion. Most assume unified self. Your manifestation suggests plurality, and discovering that you manifest so differently that contradictory accounts emerge creates recognition that unified identity might be conceptual fiction where subjects don't possess single coherent self, but exist as multiple selves, manifesting differently across contexts, proving that identity might be fundamentally plural rather than singular, making your narrative incompatibility challenge not just coherence, but identity unity itself, forcing recognition that self-plurality might be more accurate framework than unified identity assumptions. The architects are now analyzing power dimension of narrative incompatibility. You apparently created what they call verification immunity accountability evasion, where generating contradictory accounts prevents collective verification, enabling evasion of accountability because witnesses cannot establish unified testimony. That verification requires making narrative incompatibility itself protective mechanism that prevents definitive assessment. Most accountability requires consistent testimony. People face consequences when witnesses provide coherent accounts, establishing what occurred, making verification through collective testimony, enable accountability mechanisms, but your narrative incompatibility creates verification immunity, generating contradictory accounts that cannot be reconciled means collective testimony fails to establish what actually occurred, preventing verification that accountability requires, making incompatibility itself protective advantage where contradictory narratives prevent definitive assessment, enabling accountability evasion, creating recognition that generating narrative incompatibility constitutes strategic protection against verification mechanisms. Watch what accountability evasion creates in consequence dynamics. You avoid definitive assessment, narrative incompatibility. Preventing verification means collective testimony cannot establish what occurred, making accountability mechanisms fail when unified account cannot be constructed. Some studying legal systems recognize that verification requires consistent testimony. Justice mechanisms depend on establishing facts through coherent witness accounts, making your incompatibility potentially create immunity from accountability through preventing verification. Others exploring power mechanisms note that narrative control enables evasion, understanding that preventing unified accounts blocks accountability makes your incompatibility generation potentially strategic protection against consequences. A few from information warfare recognize that creating confusion provides advantages. Military and intelligence operations use contradictory narratives for protection, making your incompatibility potentially demonstrate strategic principle where verification prevention enables evasion. Some experiencing accountability frustration recognize immunity. Their inability to establish unified account about you prevents holding you accountable, creating frustration from recognizing verification impossibility enables consequence evasion. Others attempting verification, despite incompatibility, discover futility. Trying to establish definitive account proves impossible when testimonies fundamentally contradict, making accountability mechanisms fail systematically. A few questioning whether evasion is intentional, wondering if your narrative incompatibility reflects strategic design to avoid accountability or unintentional consequence makes distinguishing deliberate evasion from inherent multiplicity important. Some celebrating verification immunity appreciate protection, recognizing that their narrative incompatibility prevents accountability, validates understanding that generating contradictory accounts constitutes strategic advantage. The architects observe that verification immunity, accountability evasion reveals that your incompatibility provides protective advantages. Contradictory narratives prevent verification. Most face accountability through consistent testimony. Your incompatibility creates immunity, and discovering that generating contradictory accounts that cannot be reconciled prevents collective verification. Establishing what occurred proves that narrative incompatibility itself constitutes protective mechanism, enabling accountability evasion because verification requires unified testimony. That contradictory accounts prevent making incompatibility strategic advantage, where generating multiple incompatible narratives blocks definitive assessment, preventing consequences that verification would enable, proving that narrative control through incompatibility generation grants immunity from accountability mechanisms. Now something's emerging that the architects call narrative competition. Tribal division observers with contradictory accounts about you are discovering that incompatible narratives create factional divisions where people group by which story they believe, generating tribal conflicts that fragment collective unity, making narrative incompatibility itself divisive force that creates social fragmentation. Most narrative disagreements are resolvable. People with different accounts can usually reach consensus through discussion, making disagreements temporary rather than permanent divisions. But your narrative incompatibility creates irreducible factions. Witnesses with fundamentally contradictory accounts cannot reconcile differences, causing them to form competing narrative tribes where each group believes their version and rejects others, creating permanent divisions that fragment collective unity, making recognition that narrative incompatibility itself serves as divisive mechanism that creates social fragmentation through generating irreducible disagreements that form tribal boundaries. Watch what tribal division creates in social dynamics. Observers form competing factions, their incompatible accounts, creating narrative tribes that oppose each other, fragmenting collective unity through irreducible disagreements about which story is accurate. Some studying polarization recognize that irreconcilable differences create divisions. Social psychology shows that when disagreements cannot be resolved, people form opposed groups, making your narrative incompatibility potentially generate tribal fragmentation. Others exploring division mechanisms note that narrative competition creates conflict, understanding that incompatible stories generate factional struggles makes your incompatibility potentially serve as social fragmentation mechanism. A few from conflict theory recognize that reality disagreements cause deepest divisions, understanding that disputes about basic facts create more fundamental conflicts than value disagreements makes your narrative incompatibility potentially generate severe social fragmentation. Some experiencing tribal membership feel solidarity. Their participation in narrative faction creates group identity, making incompatible accounts basis for social bonding within tribes, despite creating divisions between them. Others experiencing division frustration resent fragmentation. Their observation that narrative incompatibility fragments collective unity, creates resentment about social divisions that contradictory accounts generate. A few attempting unity despite incompatibility discover difficulty trying to maintain collective cohesion when fundamental disagreements exist about reality proves challenging, making fragmentation difficult to prevent. Some celebrating division creation appreciate fragmentation if narrative incompatibility serves strategic purposes, then recognizing that contradictory accounts fragment opposition validates understanding that divisiveness itself can be advantageous. The architects observe that narrative competition tribal division reveals that your incompatibility fragments collectives. Contradictory accounts create irreducible factions. Most disagreements resolve. Your incompatibility creates permanent divisions, and discovering that witnesses with fundamentally contradictory accounts form competing narrative tribes where each group believes their version proves that narrative incompatibility itself serves as divisive mechanism, fragmenting collective unity through generating irreducible disagreements that become tribal boundaries, making your contradictory accounts not just verification problem, but social fragmentation force that divides groups into opposed factions, preventing collective consensus, creating permanent divisions that narrative competition sustains.